All right, so let's get started. And I'm going to be closing Facebook Live. So if you post questions, it might take a minute or two for them to come over to Discord. So just know there might be a delay. They will get posted over to me on Discord so I can see them, or excuse me, Zoom. And then at any point ask questions, and if it makes sense for me to stop and go through that one right then I will. Otherwise, I'll hold all questions for the end. So the first topic that we're actually going to talk about today is copyright, which is like, excuse me. And what we need to know about copyright in terms of like how this is going to affect the work that we make in Illustrator or Photoshop or any of these creative programs that Adobe makes. So what is copyright? Copyright is basically protections for creatives, and it's really easy to get sued for it either as a creative or somebody who uses content made by other people. And so the long short of it is that the idea was that you should be rewarded for creative works. This idea is actually older than the United States. It came over to the United States from Britain, and back then it only lasted for a couple of years. It's like somebody would write a play, the play would get published, and like it should be a couple of years before somebody else could do the same play or rip it off to make money. Something to keep in mind about copyright is the second anything gets made, it's copyrighted. And when I say made, all sorts of things can be copyrighted. So here we have kind of this humorous video of a guy using a squirrel to make a squirrel painting. So in this video, the joke, as in being able to smack a squirrel against the paint canvas to make a squirrel painting, is copyrighted. The video itself, the display of this idea is copyrighted. The red splatter painting from the squirrel is also copyrighted. And then the final painting there is also copyrighted. So there's many layers of different things that can be copyrighted. And there's also, of course, unfortunately, tons and tons of weird little exemptions about when and how you can use copyrighted materials. Like what I'm doing right now is perfectly fine because of an education workaround where if something's very illustrative of my point, I can use it to talk about my topic. Copyright can expire, but it varies by media. So generally stuff pre-1924, unless you're in music, is going to be in the public domain. And there's plenty of exceptions for how and when you can use it. One other thing we should keep in mind is that there's also two kinds of copyright. There's the kind where the moment you make something new and novel, it's copyrighted. And then there's registered copyright. So if you register your work and somebody uses it, then the amount of money you can get from them is much, much higher. So how do we get in trouble? How do we not get in trouble with copyrighted works? So just don't use works that are copyrighted. So there's something called the public domain, and these are works that have either expired, have been released to the public, and this is sometimes going to be released in something called the Creative Commons, or anything made by the US government is also going to be public domain. So like if you see all these wonderful pictures that NASA keeps putting out, you see posters of them everywhere, and you're like, why did the US government sell these? And it's like, well, they didn't. They uploaded the picture to the internet, and you can just use that picture. In terms of expired copyright, just because something was made after 1924, it doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't entered the public domain. Because again, stuff can be released, or stuff can also just have, like there's been a couple waves of copyright having to get updated, and if it wasn't done correctly, some of those things will be in the public domain. So like this is really common for written works. So like today, we're going to be making a COVID poster, so we need a picture of COVID. So look at this nice little graphic that the CDC, which is a government entity, made, and they have it uploaded to their public health image library for us just to use. So we are going to use this image. It's made by the US government. It's thusly in the public domain and free for us to use. Very nice. Now there's also a bunch of exceptions for when you can use something that is copyrighted. So exceptions, this is what we call fair use. And I say don't rely on these. So this is where you see really weird copyright cases where somebody will use something and like it goes back and forth whether or not it counts as this. So like education, parody, news reporting, research, transformative use. Transformative use is the one that they usually get in trouble for. And then there's some other random ones that are less, that you see less often. And so like what transformative use is where you use a reference picture, which is what we're going to be doing today. And in our case, with how far we're going to be changing the hands when we're tracing them, I think this would count very easily as transformative use. But examples where people have gotten in trouble would be like Shepard Fairey with that very influential Obama Hope poster. He got sued for copyright infringement for that because he used a reference picture for it directly, basically applied a filter to it. Unfortunately, that one got settled out of court, so we didn't get to see how it worked. And there's what's called the 4-factor test. So this is what a judge will look at when he's deciding whether or not you violated somebody's copyright. And the long short of it is, did you use all of their work or part of their work? And did your use of the work damage their ability to make money from it, and or did you make money for it? Basically, like if you can avoid fair use, avoid it. Or if the image that you're using is identifiable, then you might get in trouble. All right, so finding images. So here's our hand washing image that, here's a hand washing image that's very similar to the one we could use. And the one we have is like a little hand of bar soap in it, but it's from the same shoot actually. So you can find images that are just free. And there's lots of good websites for finding these guys. So like Pixabay, Unsplash, Morguefile, and then anything on Wikimedia is all going to be in either the Creative Commons or public domain. And when I say Creative Commons, it will tell you underneath it, like its usage terms. And usually it's just like, you got to credit who made it. And you can also search by usage. So like Flickr and 500px, people will upload photographs and images up onto the website and they'll have like a creative use for it. And usually people are pretty cool about it. Like if you're not using it to make money, you can use it for whatever you want. All right, so let's get started on our poster. And I need to switch to Illustrator, which needs to be open first. And Illustrator and share. All right, since we're going to be, since today will also be a mixture of review of what we've done in the past, I'm going to quickly go through some of the things that we covered last time, and then we'll get to some new stuff. So like last time we talked about creating and saving and exporting your file. So let's go through creating again real quick. You can go to create new file, whatever way you want to make a new file with. There's a bunch of these pre-saved ones that you can use to make whatever you want, or you can type in your settings over here on the right. So we can enter in our file name. So I'm going to put in COVID hand washing. And we can put in our dimensions. I'm going to put in 11 by 14, which is, you know, a standard frame size, a standard poster size, like 11 by 17 or 18 by 24, you know, whatever you want. Orientation will do portrait. Artboards will do 1. Remember, artboards is the number of workspaces. Bleed, we are not going to worry about. Bleed is that extra space that will go around, in this case, our 11 by 14 work area, that we'd want all of our images and color and text, all of our images and color to run off into. So like if it was being mass produced, you wouldn't end up with white edges from the cutting. Color mode. So we're going to pick RGB. But remember that we have 2 different color modes, RGB and CMYK. CMYK is generally the default in Illustrator because this is the one that commercially prints well. We're going to be making this for as if we're going to be sharing it on the computer, so we'll do RGB. Really easy rule. If you're going to be making like 100 copies, CMYK. If it's going to be RGB, if it's anything else, then you're probably going to make it in RGB. The nicer printing processes will benefit from RGB, and the computer is RGB. So computer and like high-end printing RGB, CMYK mass produce. Oops, I closed some settings. There we go. Advanced options, there we go. Raster effects. So remember when we talked about the difference between raster and vector, number of pixels versus math. If you're going to be printing it 300 ppi, if you're going to be using it on the computer, 72. This isn't going to really matter too much for us. I'm just going to leave it at 300. And that will be good for us to get started. So then you would click create, and it would give you your workspace. Now, I'm not going to use this one. I'm going to use the file that I sent to you guys earlier. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'm going to open up the hands.ai or Illustrator file that I had set up for us from about where we stopped in the last exercise. So I'm going to go ahead and open up hands.ai. And all I've done is I've gotten some stuff already rolling for us. So last time we talked about putting images in there. So our images are already in here as embedded images. So, like there's our COVID. And then I've already started tracing out these hands. So to move forward on this, what we want to do is finish tracing out these hands. So I'm going to zoom in, and actually let me reset my workspace to make sure that we look the same in terms of our workspace. So I'm going to go to Reset Essentials Classic. And if your workspace doesn't look like mine, it's probably because you're in Essentials like this. So up here in the top right, go down to Essentials Classic. Remember, Adobe is trying to make their programs more user-friendly, but by doing it, they're making them less user-friendly. So whenever you have the option of doing Essentials Classic, I would use Essentials Classic. And then I'm going to click my little expand out button to expand out my stuff. And actually, I'm just going to pull out my layers and drop it right here because I use just to make it easier for me to access them. And again, I just did that by clicking and dragging on that panel. Quick review of terminology from last time. Over here, we have our toolbar. Across the top, we have our options bar. Then we have our menu bar up at the very, very top. And then we have our panel section, which is different controls basically for our tools. Not always 100%, but mostly. To zoom in and out, I could always use the magnifying glass, or I can hit Command or Control plus or minus on my keyboard to zoom in and out. And then I can always hit Command 0 to fit everything on my screen. So in this case, I'm going to hit Command plus and zoom in on these hands. And then I'm going to hit the space bar so I get my hand tool and drag up so I've got it nice and centered on here. And again, whatever tool you have selected, you can get the hand tool by hitting the space bar, which allows you to click and drag on your screen to move your point of view around. Then I want to make sure that my COVID is hidden. So I'm going to poke it in the eyeball so it's gone. And I'm going to make sure that my hand reference image is locked. So I'm going to make sure this little lock right here is toggled on so I can't accidentally click and select on it with any of these tools. Because otherwise, if I have it unlocked, then I can start messing with it and it causes problems. Lock. Okay, so we have our initial hand shape and we need to finish adding in these details for the finger. So I'm going to come over to my pen tool and I'm going to click on the pen tool. And if you click and hold on it, you can see we've got our other one. So I just want the regular pen tool and I want to finish these lines off. So I'm going to click, let's do this thumb line right here. And so you can click on the path to drop a point right there. We'll drop a point at the top of the thumb right there and we go down here. Or the questions and answers being not posted in chat, they're being posted in question and answer. If you could post your questions in chat, having the question and answer window open is a lot of stuff. Is this a specific application we have in Microsoft? This is Adobe Illustrator, and it's an Adobe program, so you would download it and add it to whatever computer you have. And yes, this is Adobe Illustrator. And you can see while I'm drawing this in here, I'm getting like this weird white fill area. And that's because that's how I have this accidentally set up. So remember, whatever pen tool I'm using, it's going to have this as its main attribute. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this default fill and stroke button. And it's going to set it so the stroke is black and the fill is white. Remember, the stroke is what follows the path that I'm making. The fill is what goes on the inside. And then with this fill active, so that white square on top, I'm going to click this square with the red line through it to remove the fill. So now I'm just drawing a black line. And now that I've got it on there and I'm happy with it, I can click and hold on my pen tool to get my anchor point tool. And this is going to allow me to click on my anchor points or on my lines to drag them around to form my shapes. However, notice how this is very thin. It's like I need to change it up a little bit. So I'm going to grab my select tool. So that's my first one right here. And I'm going to click on that line so it's active. And then I'm going to change my stroke, which again is the thickness of the line, to be thicker. So I'm just going to click up onto it until it says 5, and now it's the same thickness as the rest of these lines. And I've got, you know, a tolerable thumb. You know, maybe we want to add in that knuckle. So why don't we go ahead and click on the pen tool again and go to the Add Anchor Point tool. And I'm going to go ahead and click where that knuckle is on the path. So it'll say path when I'm on the spot I want to be. And it adds an anchor point. And that way, when I go back to the anchor point tool, I can make it a little bit of a shape. So I'm just going to click on this line and drag in a little bit. And I'm going to click on this line and drag out a little bit. And then to clean it up, I'm going to click on that handle. Same thing right here. Let's reset that one. And then I'm going to click and drag to get that thumb. All right, so let's add in the rest of the fingers. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the pen tool. And I'm going to click here. And let's just click right about there on the path. Then I'll hit Escape. I'm going to click here, click on the knuckle, and then click on that anchor point right there. And then I'm going to hit Escape so I don't continue to draw that line. And I'm going to do the same thing right here, like so, and then hit Escape so I don't continue to draw that line. And looks like I need to do one more, so I'll click on this anchor point right there, and I'll continue this out to the path for the bar of soap, and then hit Escape. So again, I'm not continuing to draw that line. So let's switch back to the anchor point tool, and let's just add a few little bends in here just to make this look, you know, a little bit better. And let's click on this anchor point, drag out. You can see how like it flipped the wrong way, so I'll just drag it the other way a little bit. Just add a little bit of a curve, and I think actually I'm going to leave those ones straight. So there we have our quick and dirty hands. So let's clean up our workspace a little bit. I'm going to hit Command-0 to zoom out. Decent hands. And then I'm going to click the eyeball next to my reference image so it goes away, so I have just my hands. And then I want to select my hands so I can put them in a group so my layer system over here is a little bit more clean. So I can, with the Select tool, click and drag on my artboard, that white space around the hands, and select them that way. Or I can always hold down the Shift key and click over here to the right of the part that I'm trying to select to add in this case, a blue dot, but it'll be whatever color our layer label is, and add them all in this way as well. And which way you use kind of depends on how clean your space is right now. Since we only have the hands on here right now, it's pretty easy just to grab them that way. Then you can hit Command-G or Control-G to group them, or you go up to Object and Group. And what this does is it puts it like almost in its own little mini layer, so they're all together. And what's really nice about this one, it makes this area much easier to read. But now when I click on my hands, it moves that whole set of chunks of stuff together as a set. If they're not grouped, so I'm going to ungroup them, and I click on a part, it moves just that part. And that isn't to say if I group them, I can't go through and move just that part after the fact. It just means that I'll have to go through and select it within that group dropdown. So anyway, they're all grouped together right now, nice little group. And I'm going to double click where it starts saying group, and I'm going to label this hands. And I'm going to double click on this where it says images. I'm going to put down hands reference. And I'm going to go ahead and leave that locked. You know what? Let's make this even a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to do that by clicking the little box plus sign right here down at the bottom of my layers panel. Notice how it now shows up in red. I'm going to double click on this layer and label it virus. And I'm going to click and drag this hidden image to be up in that virus layer. So now it's like it's a mega group, is how you kind of think of that layer, except they don't move together when you click on it. So my virus picture is now up in there, and where it says layer 1, I'm going to label you hands. And let's get a little ahead of ourselves, and let's go ahead and make one more layer. And this layer 3 will label text. All right, so for now, we don't want to be moving our hands. I want to work on the virus. So I'm going to lock my hands layer so I don't accidentally move stuff in it. And I'm going to open up my virus layer, and I'm going to click on that image that is the coronavirus. Then I'm going to make it visible, and I am going to select it. So for creative reasons, I don't necessarily want this much detail in my virus. So I'm going to simplify this using that tool I said is almost always a mistake to use. But in this case will work out very well for us, called image trace. So when I have my image selected, it will tell me the name of it, it'll tell me where it is, and whether or not it's embedded or unembedded. Remember, embedded means that when I save my Illustrator file, there's a copy of it that stays inside of my Illustrator file. If it's unembedded, it's saved onto my computer and it can cause a headache. So I'm going to click on where it says image trace. And you'll get a warning saying it's a big fancy image. You should tell it not to show again and click OK, and it's going to think a little bit to convert this into a raster image. I mean, a raster image, a vector image. And so in this case, we got a black and white one because that's the default. And it's actually kind of cool, but not really what I'm after. So I'm going to click this box right here next to where it says viewing tracing result, or I can come up to window and come down to image trace to open up the same thing. And I'll get the image trace panel. I'm going to click the little arrow right next to advanced to drop that open so I can see everything that's in here. So mode, where it says preset, where it says default, let's flip through a couple of these and see which ones look the best. I think we're going to end up with 6 or 16 colors. And what's nice about reducing the number of colors is if you decide to kind of go with a different color scheme, by limiting the number of colors, it's easier to hit that color scheme. And it's also easier to select a color from this new image trace and change it to something else, which we'll do in a second once it's done thinking about life. Again, as we go, if you have any questions, feel free and please do post them. And the reason why we wouldn't want to like image trace her hands is because the cleanup to get something usable out of her hands would be very difficult. But in this case, all I'm trying to do is just simplify this image into more of a graphic. And in that case, this is going to work very well. Oops, 16 colors looks a little too high. So let's try dropping down to 6. And again, just by simplifying it, I'm just trying to make it feel more like a graphic, because your eye is going to be naturally drawn towards areas of high detail and high contrast. And by reducing the detail and contrast, it will help push the emphasis towards what my real goal for people to look at, which is the hand washing symbol and the text that I will be adding after setting this up. Ooh, my computer's not liking it. Fingers crossed, guys. Yeah, that looks nice and basic. Yeah, we'll go with that. So I'm just going to click off to the side of it, and it's now no longer selected. And I'm going to go ahead and close image trace by clicking on the X. Now notice right now that my virus is on top of my hands, which, don't look good, yo. So I need to change my layer order. So I'm going to click on my virus layer and drag down until I see a blue line appear underneath hands and release. And now it is underneath my hand layer. And then with my virus still selected, I want to center it, and let's start working on the hand layout and the text. So I'm going to click the center button right here, and it's going to, it looks like it was already centered. Come on. No, it's still in image trace mode. It's going to take it a hot second. And the reason why we can see the virus through the hands right now is because remember, we didn't set a fill. So we're actually going to go ahead and fill these in white. And we're going to make our bar of soap maybe yellow or blue. We'll decide in a minute. Ooh, really doesn't like path smoothing, does it? That's the problem with doing these complex images. All right, there we go. I'm going to collapse down my virus layer and lock it. I'm going to unlock my hands layer, and let's start looking at filling in certain colors in here. So right now, we've got all these random shapes, and if we click through them, we can see what is controlling what. And then we have our main hand outline, and we've got our main soap. So I'm going to click on my soap, and then up here in the top left where I've got that cross through, I'm going to click on it, and let's try yellow. Ooh, it's pretty punchy. Let's move that to orange, yellow. Let's go with yellow. And then I want to change the appearance of that yellow because, you know, that's a little punchy. And so that's where I'm going to come over to this color area over here. And I'm going to click on my options hamburger menu. I'm going to do show options, and it'll give me these nice little sliders. And I'm just going to drag brightness up to kind of drop the saturation down in that yellow a little bit. Looks like I took it up to about 160. Then I'm going to click my hands outline, and I'm just going to set the fill to this to white. Which, yeah, there you go. Then I'll select my whole group, and you know what? This will look better if we turn it. So you see how like I've got this bounding box around it, and I could use this bounding box to stretch it, or if I hold down the shift key while clicking to make it bigger. Which, yeah, let's make it a little bit bigger. So go ahead and hold down the shift key and mouse over until you get this symbol over the bottom one. And then if I mouse over the corner, I get bent arrows, and that will allow me to turn it. And if I don't hold down the shift key, I get free turning. But if I hold down the shift key, it moves it by chunks of 45. In this case, you know, about 260-ish. Let's bring you down to about there. Up a little bit. Yeah. You know what I think would add a lot to this would be a border. So I'm going to click on my text layer, and I'm going to click this shape tool. And in the shape tool, I'm going to click, make sure my fill is active, and I'm going to set my fill to nothing. So right now I just have a black line stroke. And let's set our stroke size to, I'm going to guess 10. And you can click and drag to add this. Or what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on here, and our image size, or artboard, excuse me, size is 11 by 14. So why don't we do 10 by 13? So about ½ an inch all the way in, and click OK. And then I can, with it still active, click the center tool right here, align to center, and align to center. So now I've got, you know, a nice little fancy border. And you know what? These corners in this border aren't doing it for me. So I'm going to make that border active again. You notice how there's these little circles in each corner? So I'm going to click and drag on that circle to round my corner. You know what? Let's round it to about ½ an inch. And now we've got this kind of nice, almost like it was like a bathroom sign, rounded corner thing going on our poster. And looking how it's kind of laid out, I want to move the hands a little bit more in that, now that I've seen what that border looks like. All right, so our COVID in the background is still a little punchy. So before we add our text, let's do one more thing to it. So I'm going to unlock it, open it, and I'm going to click and make it active. And I'm going to need to expand this. So when I click expand, I'm no longer going to be able to change my image trace, but I'm going to get some more controls over it that I want. So I'm going to click expand. And so expanding breaks it down into all those paths and shapes. So if I wanted to, I could click this open and oh my goodness, and start changing and moving things around. Instead, I'm just going to select that whole group, and where it says opacity, I can click on the arrow and drag down, or I can type in a value right here. I'm going to type in 50 and see what that looks like. And 50 looks pretty good. And all this is doing is changing the opacity of it. So like if this was over the hands layer, you could see the hand layer through the COVID. But since our background is white, it just kind of bleaches it out for us, which is a very quick and easy way to do it. All right, so let's add some text. So text tool, T for text. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward. And the text tool is also fairly straightforward. Let's lock this stuff so I don't accidentally try to draw shapes in them. And then click on the text layer. So I'm going to put it inside the text layer, and I can just click and I get lorem ipsum, and I can start typing in whatever I want. So wash your hands. Now we have a lot of ways to control the text that we make. So Let me move some of these little windows around that are blocking my text thing. So over here in properties, I have the character window, which is what I really want to see. I'm going to click the dots so I can see all the options. You know what? Why don't we just open it truly over here in window, type, and character. And then we're going to click on the little menu button for it, and we're going to do show options so we can see everything. Now we've got some of these options up here in our tool options bar, but I think the character window is much more useful and has, more controls. So the first thing that we want to do is that's way too small. So I can either click on it and highlight it and change the text size, just like what you do in Microsoft Paint or Word. Or if the text tool active, if you hold down the Command or Control key, depending on your operating system, you get a bounding box around it, which allows you to click and drag the size of your text. And it will distort your text unless you hold down the Shift key, which will then move it proportionally in size. Now this is, like I'd want it to be bigger than this. So maybe I'd want to bold it, but we don't have bold available in this font. So we need to think about our font choices. So we can click this drop down and we get tons of different fonts. Move some of these little window guys again. And choosing a font is, there's like a whole, in graphic design, there's a whole class for it. And there's a lot of kind of theory and desire that goes into picking a font. As long as you don't pick Comic Sans, the internet will not yell at you. And then from there, it's all up to you. So like I have a font labeled Propaganda, which I think would work very well for this one, but I don't think that would be available for you, so we'll pick a different one. But like what I like about Propaganda is it's got this kind of nice little slightly handwritten feel to it, like it was done with like a paint marker or something like that, and it's very thick and bold. And that to be one of the things that I would look for in your font is what's going to draw attention, what's going to fit our theme. So like this one, our minion variable has like a serif on it, which is those fancy little doodahs like an RW. And that makes it too hard to read. So we want to do what's called a sans serif font. So let's make this easier to find fonts that we want to use. So where it says filters, I'm going to click the sort by classification, and I am going to click that very first M, sans serif, without serif. And you can see that that pulls off all of the really fancy, hard to read fonts. I want to pick something that is very easy to read. And when I see these little drop downs next to it, that also tells me that it probably has like a regular, bold, italic, and other little things like that for it, which can make it easier, which will make it better for us in terms of getting a good appearance. So you can pick whatever font you want. You all should have Tahoma, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Tahoma. And where it says regular, I'm going to go ahead and pick bold. And that just kind of makes it nice and punchy. Let's change this up still a little bit further. So in here, I have my font size. Here I have my leading size, which here, let me hit enter so we can see what leading looks like. I got to select it all. There we go. Which is, how far down it drops down from the previous line. We have our tracking. Kerning, which is our distance in between characters. So like if I wanted to reduce the spacing between individual letters, so let's say this H and A, and just right there, I would put my cursor between the H and A, and I put 100 in there, and you see how it kind of bumps over a little bit. Or if I wanted to make it further away, I would use a positive value instead of a negative value. Now the one next to it is like that, except it applies to everything. So if I select everything, I can apply that same kind of transformation to all of my lettering at once, which I think I am going to go ahead and do. So why don't we do about -50. And what that's going to let me do is make my text even bigger on here. And it's going to condense my words down to almost be more like symbols of that word. So now I can go ahead and transform my text again. So I'm going to select all of it. I'm gonna hold down the Command or Control key, and I can mouse over and hold down the Shift key on that corner and, you know, make this even bigger. And we'll drag you up a little bit. Next we have our height, width, how much stuff is offset, and then we can also you know, rotate our stuff if we wanted to, which I don't really want to rotate it. We can also do all caps, which I think is fairly straightforward. Mini caps, which I think we are going to do. Superscript and subscript. So this is how like you do like you know, one. So like I've got one right here, but I want it to be like a notation in a book. I can do superscript once I select it, superscript, and now it's, you know, a little up and above. And then underline and strike through, which we're not going to use. So not too bad. And you know what? Let's make this even bigger. Select all of you guys and transform even bigger. And I don't like the placement of hands. So you know what? Instead of trying to like use spacing and stuff to try to get it in placement, I'm just gonna go ahead and take hands and I'm gonna hit Command X or Control X to remove it. And I'm just gonna drop it into a new text layer, which will allow me to position it how I want. Now looking at all this, I think our hands need to be a little bit bolder. So I'm going to close my character window. I'm going to unlock my hands. I'm going to select my hands. And again, I'm just doing that by selecting the layer. And since this is the only thing, nope, actually we need to select just the hands, not the, not the locked hand reference. And I'm going to go ahead and increase the stroke on this up to 10 to kind of match the stroke that we put around this one. And looks like we're doing well. And you know what, this COVID thing's a little bit too punchy. So I'm gonna come over to my COVID, I'm gonna unlock it, I'm gonna select that group, and let's try, I don't know, 30%. Look off to the side. Very good. And you know what, I think maybe we want more of those. So let's talk about duplicating this guy. So I'm gonna click on and select my COVID, and then I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key, depending on my operating system, and I'm just going to click and drag on that group and drag down and release, and now I've got 2 of them. So I'm going to lock that top one, and I've got my regular select tool active, and now I can click and drag, and I've got 2 of them. I'm going to come over here to the corner, hold down the Shift key, and click and drag down to make a smaller COVID. And you know, let's overlap them because I think that'll look attractive. And let's do that one more time. So I'm gonna grab this guy, and when I have it selected, I don't always have to Alt drag down here in my layer to duplicate it. I can also Alt drag over here to do exactly the same thing. You know, Alt or Option, depending on our operating system, will duplicate. So I'm gonna go over the corner again, hold down the Shift key and shrink it down, and let's stash it a little bit about behind the hands. Looking at our layout, I'm going to grab this one, just drag you up a little bit. And if you have trouble with placement, it's a lot like photography, where it's kind of like, think of the different rules of composition. So in this case, we have rule of odds, 1, 2, 3. And if you have a huge amount of trouble with placement of like, where should I put my stuff? You can always use something called gridding. So I'm not gridding on this one because I didn't think I needed it. So let's take a look at how you would set up a grid in Illustrator to help you with the placement of your stuff. So I can come up to Illustrator, Preferences, and I can come down to Guides and Grid. And this will allow me to generate a grid based on whatever sizing I want. So let's say 0.5. So every ½ inch, I'll have a grid. I will click OK. And then I'll come up to View, Show Grid, and I can start placing and locking elements based on my grid to kind of help give a sense of order. And this falls into something called Gestalt theory, which we don't really have time to get into. But it's something like if you have trouble with figuring out how and where you want to lay your things out, Gestalt theory is a series of guides and rules for doing that. Let's make our hands even bigger. Maybe not. And you can kind of see, like, as we start moving things around, other things need to move around in relation to it. All right, so you have a hand washing poster. How do you get this out of Illustrator? So first thing you'll want to do is go to File and Save. Save your AI file, your Illustrator file, your ability to come back and make changes to this after the fact and do whatever you want to it. Then you'll need to go up to File, and you'll want to go to Export and go to Export As. And this will give us a series of options to send out the file. So we've got PNG, which was one that which supports transparencies, which has a lot of transparency in it. JPEG, which is very internet friendly, and then TIFF, which is very printer friendly. So let's say I was planning on sending this to somebody and I wanted them to be able to print a high quality version. I'd send them a TIFF. I'm going to be sharing it on the internet. I'd share it as a JPEG. If somebody needed to preserve the transparency, so like this background right here isn't actually white. It's transparent. So like if you load this onto the internet, it could cause issues. But if you needed that, that's where PNG would come into place. Now, if I wanted to send this to somebody and I wanted them to still be able to edit it after the fact, I would want to send them an SVG. And SVG is not 100%, but it's kind of like an open source version of Illustrator. So like if somebody wanted to open this in Inkscape, they could. And then you would click export and it spits out the file for you. So you can see this one is in PNG. So let's do JPEG, export, export as PNG, and we're going to go down to JPEG and yes, use my artboard and do export. And I'll get my how do you want it window. I'm going to do my color mode in RGB because that's what I made it in. Illustrator and other programs like to be like, send it in 6. And I'm like, why JPEGs are small, send it at 10. Compression method, baseline standard is fine. Resolution, since this one would be like an internet version, maybe I would do 72 instead. And then I would click OK and it would get spat out onto my computer for me to send to people. Now let's take another minute and look at how we get more fonts. Because like when we go into here and we've got our font window for characters, where are we? Like there's just, we don't really have that many options when we look at this. Like, yeah, there's a bunch in here. You won't have any of these ATC ones. Those are some ones I've installed. Like there's just not that many options. Like how do we add more options to, Illustrator and really actually any Adobe program? Because one of the really nice things about Adobe is if you have a font in Illustrator, you have a font in everything. So you go to Adobe Fonts. And give me a second to switch my screen share. And Keynote, Chrome, there we go. All right, so everyone should be able to see Keynote right now. Fonts right now. And so when you first come to the Adobe Fonts page, you can just click on Explore Fonts, or you can search for a font, or you can see what fonts you already have with My Fonts. Yep, click OK. And so you can see that here's all the fonts that I've got installed from Adobe, and you're like, I use them every so often. All right, so I'm going to click Browse Fonts. And I get just, all of the fonts, and holy cow, there's 160 pages of these. So like, how am I going to figure out which ones I want to use? And again, it comes down to that idea of what are you going to be using this font for? So for us, we would want to pick for our poster, depending on the feeling we wanted to give it, sans serif, which would be a very quick and easy to read font. So like, do I want people to read it? Now, if I was making like a logo or something that was supposed to be like aesthetically attractive, well, then maybe I'll grab one of these serif fonts or these slab serif fonts. Slab serif fonts have like little slabs at their feet. And this kind of like makes it classier. So like, let's say I wasn't going to be hanging this around like a school or something like that, but I was going to be hanging it like in a high-end restaurant or like a high-end business, then, maybe I'd make it a little bit less readable and make it more attractive. Maybe let's say I've got like a boutique kind of store and I want to kind of like make it feel a little bit even classier. I can use one of these script fonts Although in this case, since our point of our poster is to be easy to be read, I'm not sure I would go with a script or, you know, like this black letter one, just because like these don't parse, they don't read very quickly. Mono would work just fine though, and so would hand. So like we can pick these different types and see which ones would work well. Now notice how all of these say the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. This is just a generic phrase, kind of like lorem ipsum, that people use to see you know, what it looks like. Underneath here, I have different properties, so I'm going to pick a heavyweight because heavyweight is bolder and easier and more eye-catching. I'm not super concerned about X height, so like that's how high, you can kind of see it in this H, like how much of that tail is there. Width is fairly self-explanatory. I don't really care about standard step, and I really don't care about figure style. Contrast can be useful for finding fonts that are quicker and easier to read. In our case, you know, any of these is going to be fine, except for maybe this last one's a little hard to parse on some of these. Like that's a little bit more fancy. But basically, the simpler it is and the bolder it is, the easier it is to read. We can also choose different text right here to better fit what we're doing. And then we can also increase the text size to be closer or different from what we're going to be looking through. So what I would do at this point is I would flip through these and find a font that you think would work relatively well for our poster. So like if I was going to do this in a college setting, this one right here, Sketchnote, this would work quite well. And I've got different versions of it. So regular, text bold. And to add it to Adobe Font, to add it to Illustrator, I click Activate Font, and you know, let's just activate this whole family. In fact, I can just come up here and just do Activate All right here, and it spits them all out. Now here's the catch. Remember what we talked about at the start? We talked about copyright. Is a font copyrightable? The answer is yes. This is, again, where Adobe Font can really save you. So this is why I'm not saying, you know, just Google up a font and throw it in there, or, you know, just use one on your computer or whatever. The ones that come out of Adobe Font, as long as you use them while you have an Adobe subscription, as long as you create the file that you're making, while you have an Adobe subscription, that font is considered licensed for you, as in your subscription has paid them money for, you know, your version of Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever, and they say, cool, you're allowed to use all of our fonts. And what's really nice about the way Adobe's license work, which is not something I say about Adobe a lot, is if you stop having an Adobe license, that usage of that font for that particular file stays okay. But that isn't to say that like after your license ends, if you still have a copy of that font on your computer, you can't make new stuff with it, but your old stuff is still fine. So one of the big reasons to use Adobe Font, not only is it easy to parse and find a font that you want, but it's also automatically licensed for you. You don't have to worry about copyright stuff, and that license applies to the image that you used it in perpetually. So, you know, sweat wiped off your head, cool. So this one was labeled Sketchnote. So if we come back to Adobe Illustrator, where are you? Adobe Illustrator, boink, and close this window. If we highlight our text and we click where it says Tahoma, in theory, clear off all of my sorting, Sketchnote should be in here. So let's type in sketch, and there it is. So I'll grab Sketchnote bold. And just like magic, it's added. Let's do that for hands too. So I'm just gonna, where it says Tahoma, type Sketchnote, and I'm gonna grab Sketchnote bold. And you know what? Now that we've changed our fonts, the space in between our W and A has gotten a little goofy. So I'm gonna go ahead and click in between them. And let's shrink that down, maybe even -100. Yeah, and let's go between our Y and our O and do -100. And you know what, the spacing over here has gotten a little too narrow, so why don't we just bump you by like, ooh, I don't know, 10? Yeah. All right, so there you go. The rest of this time was reserved for any questions and answers that I can give, because this is a lot of information over a very condensed period of time. Do you guys have any questions about how to do something, or something that you'd want to be able to do whoop, I gotta lock that, in Illustrator that I can answer in our remaining time. And you can type, I'll go ahead and open up the Facebook chat now so I can get these a little bit faster, and go ahead and type them in the Zoom chat if you have them there as well. How much does an Illustrator subscription cost? It varies depending on the version of Adobe that you get, but you can get all of Adobe as a teacher for $30 a month. And I think, don't quote me on this because they keep changing it, individual applications are $10 or $15 a month. If the font doesn't come over after we activate, is there any tricks to get them to show up? So if you're having trouble with that sort of activation, you might need to open up Adobe Creative Cloud on your computer, which is a standalone app that's used to update and manage files between all of your Adobe programs. So like if you're having trouble getting it showing up, open up and run, if my brain turns back on, Adobe Creative Cloud. And here I can go ahead and open that up so you guys can see what that looks like. Where's my share button? Will it let me share Creative Cloud? Yep. So this is what Creative Cloud looks like right here. And it even has the font thing built in right here, but it's not like a font viewer in here. It launches you to the font website. But if you go into here and check all of your syncings, that'll be done like up here in the Cloud app, and up here under here, sometimes it'll be up. They just changed it. And in fonts, you can go through here and see what's gone through, and you can also go in to manage fonts to access that stuff. But all of that will be, this will all throw you onto websites and web-based stuff. You got Facebook finally access that stuff, but all of that got to be. And that looks like it for questions. Any last ones before we call it a night? All right, well, thank you for attending, and I hope this was useful and fun for you guys. And, you know, files are yours to do what you want with.